Okay, so as I described, the first time I ever really started studying the Bible was in college, and I was studying with my grandpa. And as I mentioned, I think that my prerogative was to kind of was a leftist, was kind of communist in a sense. But I will get to that a little bit more. But I'm just going to give just one example of how that looked. Was, as I mentioned before, I wanted to see people of color as good and white people as bad, because I think it's because it was my ego. I saw myself more as Jewish and more as a person of color, and I wanted to defeat white people in a sense. So the way that I did it was like my grandpa talked about how nonconformity can be closer to the flow, and it'd be like, it's kind of like, again, like that story of the prodigal son with Jesus, where the prodigal son leaves and then he comes back and he's actually liked more than by the father than the son who stayed. And my idea was like, yeah, nonconformity, breaking free. He was able to expand his consciousness. He at least figured out what doesn't work and stuff. And that's actually closer to the flow. And I always knew that, quote unquote, black people or people of color were considered more bad, right? Or less moral. But I wanted to invert everything. And especially because people would see Jews that way and be like, no, actually, that's the best way to be. They are actually the good guys, and they're the ones who are saved. And the Gentiles who believe, if you look at every story, they end up being killed. Like the Romans, I want to believe the Romans, they ended up being destroyed, the Roman Empire. The Ninevites, they believed in God, they ended up being destroyed. The Persians, they believed in God. It says it in the Bible. They believed, and they were destroyed and killed by the Jews. The Jews were supposed to be killed because they didn't believe, but then in the end, the Jews are saved, and the people who believe, the Gentiles, end up being killed. And I wanted to invert everything and make the Gentiles bad. And a part of that was, I think it was the anti-white mentality that I had. Like, yeah, you Christians who are white, or you believers, you religious people, you all are actually the bad ones. You're not the ones who are in the flow, because the flow is actually nonconformity is closer to the flow. And the Jews might not believe, but they're closer to the flow. And I wanted to invert everything. And I thought that the Bible backed me up. Like, look, the Jews don't believe, but then they put up the snake and then they're cured. And that's like Jesus when he was put on the cross. They didn't believe, but then the Jews are saved. The non-believers are saved, but who's destroyed? The Roman Empire, or the believers. And there was another example of that where, like, there was this group of people who didn't believe, and then something happened and they were saved, and they ended up being saved in the end, but the group that believed, they ended up being killed. And I was like, see, the Bible actually is saying this. And I wanted to believe like the Bible was kind of communistic and it was anti-morality and I didn't want to believe it was communistic, and I wanted to believe it was pro people of color. And that's why too, like every way I interpret the Bible, I interpret through this lens. So I wanted to believe that like Cain and Abel was a story about nomads, being killed by the agriculturalists. And my grandpa, he wanted to think like, well, that's just an inevitable part of the evolution of humanity. But I wanted to see the Jews as more nomadic, because there's like parts of the Bible that kind of depict them as more nomadic. Like when they go into Egypt, they're described as sheep herders, and the Egyptians are agriculturalists, and the Egyptians don't like them. And I wanted to think of white people more as agriculturalists, sedentary, and people of color, like the black people, like hunter-gatherers, nomadic people. And I wanted to always see the people of color as superior to the white people. So I had this kind of anti-white proclivity, predilection. And I think it was because I viewed myself as Jewish, and I kind of viewed things that way. So I was always like very pro people of color. And I thought of myself as black, and I looked at black people and I thought, like, I would imagine myself as black when I would look at people. When I play basketball, I imagined myself as black. I even thought that I was black. Like, that's the way I was my whole life. It's kind of weird. Like, people say it's weird, but for me, it's not. Like, that's the way I was. But so I was, and now I'm not going to get into details, but later, like 2023, when I'm like studying Hinduism, I start to think to myself, whoa, I was like Shukracharya, who's a Satan of Hinduism, who's a planet Venus, because he wants the demons to defeat the demigods. And the demons represent, or in Hinduism, are the darker races, and the demigods are more the Aryans who conquered the darker races. And Shukracharya, Satan, who's a planet Venus, the morning star, who's Satan of the Bible, is on the side of the demons. He's the guru of the demons, like how Satan is the head of the ruler of the demons, right? And I thought, whoa, I actually was very satanic. I was like Shukracharya in the Hindu scriptures. I was against religion. I was a communist, and I wanted to destroy the Aryans. So I'm like, whoa, I was very satanic, and I think that I was. So I'm going to get to that. But I was basically a big time communist and anti-white and anti-religion because I thought religion was white supremacist. And then I furthered that by when I discovered the quadrant model, I was like, yeah, science is the first quadrant, religion is the second quadrant, art is third quadrant, and philosophy is the fourth quadrant. And I always kind of looked down upon the second quadrant, which is the homeostasis quadrant. And I associated the second quadrant with the white people. Asians were the first quadrant, white people second quadrant, blacks third quadrant, browns the fourth quadrant. So I looked at everything. I always try to kind of put white people down, and ultimately I know that I was kind of very satanic, and I was like what the white supremacist said. I saw myself as Jewish, and I wanted the white people to mix because I think that I saw white people as like, there might be some sort of like, I had a friend who's named Noah who was also like his dad was Jewish, and we were wondering because we both were talking about this, and we're like, what is it about Jews not liking white people kind of thing? And there might be some sort of genetic thing to it, and it could also just be the cultural aspect of like white people committed the Holocaust and stuff like that. But again, now when I look at it not through a good versus bad, but who knows, maybe in the Bible, God sends the Philistines, who are apparently Indo-Europeans and other groups, to fight the Semitic darker groups. But God sends it. So who's really bad? Sometimes maybe it is punishment from God. Now, when at this time, my grandpa kind of insinuated that type of stuff. But I hated that because I hated religion, again, because I'm like, yeah, you see, religion always blames the victim, which tends to be the people of color. And I'm like, no, it's not because of sin. It's just because of power differentials, climate, like the white people came down and power differentials. And I like Jared Diamond, who's a Jewish philosopher who I learned about in high school from my Jewish teacher who did a assimilation and conflict class, who would talk about how race is social construction, right? And which is in a sense, but it isn't also in a sense. But Jared Diamond would say, no, white people aren't superior. Again, he's Jewish, and he's saying this though, but white people aren't superior. It's just because Europe is the east-west axis, and because of the climate of the area, it was conducive to agriculture, which was conducive to domesticating these animals, and this allowed for the creation of guns, germs, and steel, which allowed the white people to conquer these people. So I wanted to look at everything through that rationalistic, scientific, materialistic, physicalistic lens, as opposed to which my grandpa was more trying to lean me toward, which was a spiritualistic lens. But I hated everything spiritual because, again, I saw spirituality as more white supremacy, as maintaining morality, maintaining the status quo, as religion, which I saw as white supremacy again. And just like one example was like, I hated the freaking astrology people. I thought astrology was crap because, and I thought that it was related to religion, and I thought it was white supremacy. It was just crazy, and everything religion I saw is more white supremacist. And I want to see things more in a materialistic lens and Darwinistic lens. And even like David Icke, like I saw David Icke, and the reptilian theory is just a white supremacist theory against the Jews, basically, mainly. And and basically he was insinuating that there was Jews who were reptilians, and they're the ones. And now I understand, he's saying that they're trying to mix the races, and ironically, I was doing that. Like, I was one of the people that David Icke didn't like. But basically, I saw anything. He's very spiritual, right? And I saw spiritual people tended to be racist, I thought, and they tended to be just anti people of color more. Now, what was I gonna get at with? Oh, and so I wanted to look at things more through the physicalistic lens and materialistic lens, and like just one example of that would be like, I wanted to see religion as just an epiphenomena of Darwinism. So just one example of that would be like I would notice, like when I went to Kauai, I noticed that the Filipinos tend to go to Iglesia Ni Cristo, and the Tongan people go to the Mormon church. And I noticed that people divide based off their ethnicity. And I thought even when these cultures created their religions, they did it based around their ethnicity and their environments and what was good for their ethnicity and good for their gene survival. So I thought, like, yeah, they don't eat pork because it's bad for survival, because pork had worms in it that would kill people. So they say it's from God, but really it's just what's good for their survival, and they said it was from God. So that's the way I wanted to see things, more through that materialistic lens. I'm going to get to how I saw things a little bit more complex than that, and I questioned that, but that's the way I really wanted to see things, because I think it was because I saw religion as white supremacist, and I wanted to uproot it, and I wanted to subvert it. And just like another example of that would be, yeah, well, just the fact that like there was a cult that I was going to, a Korean cult, where they believe that uh, their leader was a Korean guy, and they believed that he was the second coming of Christ. And I thought, of course, they're going to believe that because they're Korean, and that's good for their genes to look up to another Korean guy, and that maintains the solidarity of their genetic cohort in their genetic group. And I thought, yeah, so it all makes sense. Like through a Darwinian lens, it's just religions and people develop different theories or different belief systems based around what ethnic group they're in, and which is just to consolidate their ethnic groups and maintain their survival of their ethnic groups and their genes. That's the way I saw religion. Now, my grandpa, again, he doesn't see it that way. And I understand, like he would say that I was utilizing a lower level of predatory software. Now, I didn't understand what he was saying at that time, but now I think I do understand. I was grasping to that point of view, and I think there was an aspect of it was I wanted to destroy religion as in communistic way, and a part of it was a predatory stance toward white people. And I didn't necessarily see things extremely clearly. And yes, it is true that maybe groups separate based off ethnicity and stuff. And my grandpa would say it's not necessarily Darwinism, maybe as an aspect of it, an instinctual reptilian aspect of it, but there's also software, and people can upgrade their software and stuff like that. But regardless, though, I do think I had a kind of a predatory lower level of software, and I did want race mixing. So just like one more example of that would be, I remember I was at UCSD, and someone like wrote a sign that said, like, I hate racists. And I remember looking at it and I was like, that's a stupid sign, because as my grandpa would say, that's like predatory software, or like good guy, bad guy software. And it's too emotional and stuff. And I'm like, that just like that inflames racists, and that gets more solidarity among racists. Or like, see, they hate us, now we can be even stronger. So I'm like, but in my mind, I'm like, dude, don't be so freaking inflammatory and don't be so emotional. Just don't put that stuff up and just allow the races to mix. Like, we don't need to do all this inflammatory stuff that's gonna, cause ruckus and chaos and stuff. Just like, why are you trying to sabotage the race mixing? Like, in my mind, I didn't like it because of that. Now, as I said, I wanted race mixing, and my grandpa, like, as I said, he said there's no such thing as racism. But the way that I saw that, again, is I did think, of course there's racism, and you see it in religion. That's the reason why, there's a black church and there's a Korean church, because people are dividing based around their ethnic genetic groups, because that helps maintain their genetic groups. That's the way that I wanted to see it. And I thought that the reason why there was more, violence among black people, quote unquote, was I studied how, I later studied, I watched a BBC documentary that was saying that black people had more genetic diversity among them, because in Africa there's way more genetic diversity, and one family left Africa and they became everyone outside of it. So I thought there's more violence among black people because there might be some sort of subconscious way that they can gauge genetic diversity, and they see that they're very genetically distinct, and that's why there's racism among black people for black people, and you see more killing of black people by black people, along with the fact that white people and other groups discriminated against them and created conditions that harm them, and created like they don't have as much education and stuff like that, and then they'll kill each other more, right? But I thought that's also Darwinism, because there's genetic distinctions. So to me, it all made sense through a Darwinian lens. And to me, it was all just a selfish gene. I like Dawkins. I was like, yeah, dude, Dawkins is right. It's all just a selfish gene. That's what all this is. Everything we see around us is just like, just an outgrowth and an outcome of the selfish gene. And that's the way I kind of wanted to see it. Now, at the same time, though, when I discovered the quadrant model, I was starting to question that, because I was like, well, but also I'm noticing everything is built around the quadrant. So there was that anti-white thing that I had going on. And I think a part of it was because I saw myself as Jewish, and I saw white people as against Jews, and I saw them as a threat, right? And I ironically then wanted to mix the white people, but that's why the white people didn't like the Jews, right? So it's kind of ironic, the whole thing. But what was I saying? Yeah, so I'll continue in a second.